This week, the National Park Service tour takes us to the very appropriate site of the Saugus Iron Works in Saugus, Massachusetts. This was the first complete ironworks set up in North America. As a brand spanking new 17th century operation, this was one of the bog iron operations and had both furnace and forge in the same place. In operation from 1646 until about 1670, it is a restored window into the iron world at the end of the pre-industrial age. Originally restored with funding from the American Iron and Steel Institute in the 1940s and 50s, it's a fairly faithful reproduction of the first ironworks. They did have over 5,000 items uncovered during archaeological excavations at the site to work with, including the water wheel that ran the bellows, much of the original blast furnace, and the 500-pound water-driven hammer that pounded the slag out of the pig iron. It even had a rolling mill and a slitter, which were pretty advanced tools for the age and made it possible for the colonies to produce their own nails, firebacks, farm tools, and cookware. Rolling mills, because they required specialized knowledge and a fairly large amount of funding, would not be common even in 18th century American forges. They were around, but they were not common. As was typical for most archaeological reconstructions of the 20th century, the ironworks were reconstructed using a combination of original documentation, archaeology, conjecture, bias, and wishful thinking. The bias-guided wishful thinking piece is very common in many of the most famous colonial site reconstructions, including Colonial Williamsburg, William Penn's home site, and of course, these ironworks. In fairness, it was a much better job than some of the extremely fanciful reconstructions of historical sites that tended to be undertaken in the 19th century. During the time they were in operation, the ironworks went by the name of Hammersmith, but under the supervision of the National Park Service, which took over the operation of the site in 1968, they gave it the more descriptive name Saugus Ironworks for the modern visitor. It has been open to the public spring to fall just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, ever since then. This first ironworks of the New World is one of the few close-in, old-style blast furnaces you can visit and is certainly the best preserved example of a furnace and forge of this age in North America. If you want to go see where an early colonist could get the iron for their nails, horseshoes, axes, saws, cookware, and farm tools when they weren't importing them from England, this is the place to go and look into a window back in time. Episode 93. Supplying the battlefront and the home front, 1776 to 1815. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what it took to run an iron furnace and forge at the dawn of the United States of America. I'll also explain what's up with the name Valley Forge and talk about how food worked with furnaces and forges and iron on the battlefront and the home front during America's early years. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Well, I know you know that guns have always been a part of the American landscape. The first thing you need to know is that for a long time it was just long guns and big mounted guns. There wasn't anything small and nothing fast. Back here at the start, they were finicky, precious tools that required knowledge, skill, and care to operate. Quite a bit of thought and training went into making one of these things work at all. In Season 1, firearms were clumsy blunderbusses that required lit matches and clunky cannon that weren't particularly effective on the high seas. By the 18th century, cannon warfare at sea was on, and sailor food followed suit to allow long periods at sea in search of new lands, or blockading ports. Blech, the absolute worst. The musket came into its own in the 18th century, once again changing how war was done. And it changed tactics, much the way archers did in 14th century Europe, seriously altering how soldiers were supplied and deployed. At the change of the century and the change of country, two more significant iron innovations were changing the gun game once again. And there was also one big food-related iron innovation. The first iron innovation was in American shipping as it expanded out into the world. And these were swivel guns, small portable cannon. And they started showing up on merchant ships and the fast Yankee whaling ships, making them into a sort of disorganized, annoying privateer smuggler navy. This period of frequent squabbles at sea between the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and now the Americans meant any merchant ship was always in danger of finding itself the target of capture by a navy that had been a friendly or at least a neutral when he last left port. And that was on top of the regular old pirates. They were just about everywhere American shipping went or wanted to go. They came from the Spanish Main, that is, the Atlantic-facing coasts of Central and South America that were at the time New Spain. Pirates also sailed out from bases in myriad tiny islands and coves of the Caribbean. And then, of course, there were the Barbary pirates out of North Africa that targeted shipping in the Mediterranean for plunder and ransoms. With all these options for danger and more, arming one's merchant ships with swivel guns was just smart. Now, these were anti-personnel weapons, not ship sinkers, but their mobility meant the merchant captains didn't need to be war tacticians. It's true swivel guns have been around for centuries already, but it was at this age that American iron made them affordable enough that every merchantman who wanted one could get one, or several. The second iron innovation spreading out in baby America was on land. And it was the rifle. The big idea here is that a ball shot by a rifle spins, which gives it a predictable direction and allows it to go further. This technique was first employed with German crossbows and then was transposed onto German firearms in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it was German immigrants, many of them in the portion of the Louisiana Territory known as the German coast, that incubated the American rifle tradition. Early rifles were time-consuming weapons to make, and they were manufactured individually at great expense, and they required enormous amounts of skill, fine materials, and patience. German immigrant gunsmiths found abundant materials in charcoal, iron, desirable wood for gun stocks, and customers who could pay. The number of people with tobacco, sugar, indigo, timber, cattle, and cod fortunes far outnumbered the people who could pay back in the old country. And even successful farmers in places where cash was scarce, there wasn't even an idea of a single currency of the United States of America until 1792, for heaven's sakes. These farmers could pull together payment in kind. Meat, liquor, cloth, and other edibles a blacksmith required in abundance, but had no time to make or grow because he's making things out of iron. Nails, horseshoes, plows, gridirons, oven doors, hoes, bill hooks, knives, cartwheels, barrel hoops, axe heads, and the fancy, newfangled cast iron stoves. You get the drift. As the American iron industry expanded by furnace and forge, just as with meat, more people of more classes had access to more things made out of iron in the new America than just about anywhere in the world, and definitely in Europe. Germany, France, Spain, England, and Holland all had blacksmiths, ironmasters, gunsmiths, and cannon, bellcasters, with greater skill and experience at this point, but access to the items they made was more restricted to just the wealthy and to the growing industrial world, which at this point was synonymous with the extremely wealthy. But in America, ironmasters were more likely to have cheaper materials, more time, and more space at their disposal that their European counterparts did not have. Europe's burgeoning mechanical industrial age and the endless wars meant most blacksmiths were focused on making well-established items like nails, iron cart tires, and farm tools, along with the gears and machine parts in peacetime to feed the growing industrial age. But all these efforts were constantly interrupted by this war, that naval skirmish, and a constant need to supply more muskets, more cart tires, and more cannon for army carts and naval vessels. War, tradition, limited supplies, and the needs of the booming industrial age stood in the way of individual innovation and experimentation. Well, the guns of choice in Europe were regularly the simplest ones that could be made by the most gunsmiths and fired in the simplest fashion, and were provided to the various armies of various squabbling rulers and mercenary companies. In America, most of the guns being employed were the ones used by hunters. Accuracy, not ease and speed, was the desired property. So the American long rifle, based on those German designs, spread out in America. The new state of Kentucky, carved out of the overly large, unwieldy old Virginia colony, served as a main nexus of these rifles. They then spread out into Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, and up into the mid-Atlantic states, and even New England. And then, with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the rifle would travel far to the north and west, as it would be used by people who needed to find their food as they went. There will be much, much more on rifles from this quarter, but as with so much, that's later. So there were merchantmen armed with their swivel guns at sea, hunters and militiamen armed with their rifles on land. The third big iron innovation of this new nation took place at home and was the iron plate stove. Fireboxes made out of cast iron that could stand in the middle of a room or next to or as part of a kitchen fireplace definitely got their start in Europe. German, Swedish, and Norwegian immigrants coming from their homelands with their long, cold winters and good access to iron ore and timber were responsible for much of the early development of European cast iron stoves and using iron together with brick and masonry elements. But once a house was built, it was unusual to replace or update a stove that worked perfectly well. And again, the number of people who could afford stoves or new stoves was limited. However, over in this new country, absolutely bursting with trees to burn, ore to mine, and spaces to spread out, everybody was building a house. You could more or less just go out and do that. And all these houses, they needed a way to cook food. The 17th and even 18th centuries were dominated by open hearth cookery. Cauldrons and little piles of coals used under spiders and gridirons and boxy open fireplaces, that was the way cooking happened. But with the making of bricks and iron, people who were daring and inventive, they'd come to this rickety new country after all, these people were willing to take the idea of the Northern European stoves, adapt them, improve them, and then spread them everywhere. As nifty as open hearth and bake oven cooking is, and one can get awfully skilled at it, it is wasteful of fuel. Heat goes absolutely everywhere, and it's dangerous and incredibly time-consuming. But putting your fire in a box allows you to more efficiently transfer heat to your food. It contains the burny stuff, and it reduces the amount of hot ashes and coals flying around. Even better, it cuts down on the number of burned dresses, and best yet, it reduces the number of burned people. A whole lot. It also simplifies the keeping of coals overnight, so starting that morning fire for breakfast, it's much less of an ordeal. Cooking food and staying warm just got a whole lot easier. Sure, cooking for war or travel was about the same, but making pies to send on those trips and raising up well-fed kids who can work on the farm, etc., well, stoves made of iron plates absolutely changed the game. In America, there was lots of meat to cook, and now there was a much simpler, less time-consuming, safer way to do it, and it required far less learning to get right. These plate stoves still took a lot of skill, but baking cakes was about to get much easier for many people. It is worth noting that plate stoves and the future newfangled stoves are going to be much more popular and more common in places and states where slavery was uncommon. The reason I say uncommon instead of illegal is that there are plenty of people in free states who were still enslaved, either against the law of the place or through loopholes usually allowed for because the enslaver was wealthy and or prominent. Anyway, when people had to cook for themselves or pay some sort of wage to the person who did the cooking, stoves were adopted much more quickly. Plenty of people wanted servants, so there was constantly a shortage. And if you were a skilled servant, like a cook, you could usually do a fair bit to choose the homes you cooked in. And of course, you chose the places with better facilities and stayed there longer. So if the effort of cooking affected you directly, one way or another, a stove of some sort that contained a cooking fire was a no-brainer. However, if you had purchased the people who did your cooking, that is, you owned them, why would you spend good money on a fancy newfangled stove? If you're not constantly bending down to floor level to move around cast iron pots and grates and cauldrons, working to avoid popping coals and setting your skirts on fire, why in the world would the desire for a stove ever strike you? And so, in this way, these slave states, just like all societies where a semi-inescapable domestic servant or slave class exists, mechanical labor-saving devices were slow to be adopted. In the 20th century, the adoption of dishwashers, electric chopping and grinding kitchen appliances, and clothes washing machines were much slower to be adopted by the upper classes who regularly employed servants or enslaved people in domestic jobs. So in just the same manner, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, stoves were slower to come to states where the enslaving of human beings was common. And this, at last, is where food and iron really get together. So what did it take to run a furnace, and what did it take to run a forge? As we learned last week, these are two separate steps in the iron-making process, and both of them are incredibly energy-intensive. In the very early days, when it was all bog iron down near the shipping ports, and England had yet to make refining pig iron an England-only job, a furnace and forge might have been right next to each other. But these operations were usually pretty limited. The above-mentioned Saugus Ironworks was a serious exception. Usually they turned out a limited amount of iron and usually focused on cast iron objects or sending pig iron elsewhere for refinement. During the time refining pig iron was prohibited, forges were town affairs working with refined iron to make items for local consumption and to repair tools. But after England changed its policy to allow fining forges to exist in the colonies along with furnaces, forges and furnaces tended to be located in different places because they had different needs. As a rule, furnaces were located near the ore mines. Iron ore is essentially rocks, and as we all know, rocks are heavy, so the less the rocks needed to be moved, the better. But the European-designed blast furnaces with their bellows, those are the blowers that make the furnaces hotter, those were driven by water power, so they had to be near a water source to drive the bellows. And lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of wood was needed to make the charcoal that ran the furnaces. So furnaces tended to be built up in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountain Range or in other iron ore containing hills. The furnaces themselves also tended to be built into rocky hillsides. This reduced the amount of collected or cut stone needed to build the furnace. It would be easier to cut part of the furnace into a stone wall than to cut all the stones and build the furnace up. And it also gave the furnace more stability. And since charcoal, limestone, and ore would need to be put into the top of the furnace or in vents high up the side of it, it was much easier to use an existing hill to get to the top of the furnace than to build a whole entire ramp. The furnaces would also be built near a stream or a river that could be diverted to run a water wheel that would run the bellows. And the furnaces would be built in regions that had mainly hardwood, trees like oak, hickory, and chestnut, rather than evergreen trees, pine, cedars, firs, and spruces. The charcoal to run a furnace needed to be made out of the slower growing, denser, deciduous, or hardwood trees. Furnaces, due to their need to be close to the rocks, the ore, meant they were often in fairly isolated places, and many of their locations were pretty unsuitable for farming. Also, the extraction of the iron from the iron ore had fewer finicky steps than forge operations, and this meant many of the jobs could be done by men with lower skills for lower pay. The most isolated furnaces would only produce pig iron and would stay out of the business of producing cast iron. Cast iron needed more skill, and it helped to have those furnaces close to markets. At the most isolated furnaces, the food situation of iron workers was usually limited and a bit lousy. The diet had a lot more in common with a sailor's diet, and it was largely salt-preserved pork and beef, hard cheese, peas, and flour for dumplings, and maybe, if there was a good cook around, some proper bread. Being away from farms, a lot of fresh produce wouldn't survive the trip, so it wasn't brought or bought by a furnace owner to feed the workers. But root vegetables, especially onions and potatoes, did make regular appearances. Though, while a furnace was down, iron workers could hunt for fresh meat, and some women who worked in support roles might do some foraging for greens, for roots, and berries in season. Now, whether a furnace was run by enslaved men, freedmen, indentured servants, or employees, there was always a community of women who ran the support jobs. They might be hired and receive wages, or they were simply expected to do the work as part of them accompanying the men who worked at the furnace, or they were enslaved people and those were just the jobs they had to do. Because sick men can't work, or at least can't work well, the workers at a furnace, while not super well paid or exceptionally well fed, they did tend to be fed and cared for better than men in a lot of other professions. First of all, water would be provided to them during their hot work, and this was brought to them by women in buckets. It did no one any good to have workers drop of dehydration at a vital point in the heating of the ore or preparing to run the pigs. And because furnaces were always located next to or near running water, the need for water was a pretty easy one to fulfill. Salted meat, that takes hours to turn it into any sort of edible, not to mention enjoyable fare. So while the furnace ran and the men worked 12 hours at a time, or longer on occasion, women would be cooking the stews, the porridges, pottages, dumplings, and bread everyone ate at mealtimes. Because of the largely preserved nature of the food at isolated furnaces, meals would also be rather monotonous. The boredom would sometimes be broken with liquor, an occasional sweet, and sometimes fresh items gathered from the surrounding woods. But the backbone of the menu did look a lot like what a sailor would have if they had a pretty good captain who made frequent stops ashore, rather than the menu of the average farm dweller who had much more seasonal variety. In addition to preparing food and carrying water, the women and children in the furnace community would typically provide laundry services and also chop wood and burn charcoal. The most isolated furnaces also tended to be seasonal camps and usually didn't run in the deepest winter, the wettest parts of the year, or the hottest parts of the year. Mining ore was needlessly hard when mines were at freezing temperatures or in danger of flooding from the rain, and getting a furnace up to the correct temperature was made harder by inclement weather. Oh, and if the stream froze, which was common up in the hills of everywhere from Virginia and north, it couldn't be used to run the bellows and the whole operation was tied up. Same thing when the weather was too hot. Workers were hard enough to get. Having them drop dead in the heat again? Not a good way to keep your workforce around. So at this point in time, ore furnaces were not in operation year-round, which meant overall iron was still somewhat scarce, though more plentiful than in the early days. The ready access to water power and plenty of wood still made it less expensive than making iron in Europe. Once iron pigs had been made, they were transported to forges. Some areas had a single forge that took most or all of the iron made by a given furnace, and this was more typical in Virginia and other southern states where a single oligarch might have multiple industries under his power, run by the people he enslaved. These people with no say in their fates might not only work as iron miners, charcoal burners, and furnace employees, they might also be used in agricultural labor. This was a punishingly hard rotation of work no paid employee would ever stay around for. Ironically, the isolated nature of iron furnaces and the fact that they were chronically in search of workers meant that iron furnaces would often harbor enslaved people on their way out of a territory. It was a place they could do work for a wage, away from people who might be looking for them, though it was common to pay these people lower wages due to both their race and their desperation. In the areas where people had to be paid for their work, it was more common for a single furnace to supply a range of forges that purchased the pig iron. Some furnaces that were located closer to villages and cities, like Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania that I visited, and a number of other furnaces in Chester County, these were surrounded by other farms and were able to host farming and substantial worker housing on their own grounds. And it was these larger furnace operations that were integrated into a surrounding community that could also produce cast iron goods. And that's the error I made last week. Cast iron is not pounded. It is ore cooked in certain ways so that it incorporates carbon in little tiny inclusions of graphite. And differing amounts of these little balls of carbon give different cast irons different qualities. But overall, cast iron is a product of furnaces. It's only the wrought iron that comes from the forges. Whoops. Anyway, those furnaces that were not isolated way up on the side of some mountain, those had an easier time attracting more skilled workers, and so they could produce more goods for sale. And that same sand that was used to make the pigs, it could also be used to create molds for casting tools and cookware and plates for the emerging iron stoves. At the largest ironworks, swivel guns and naval cannon were also produced from specially formulated cast iron. While most of the cannon the Continental Army used were captured guns from British installations, naval cannon were made and proved in the Pennsylvania hills for use in the fledgling Continental Navy. 115 were produced at the Hopewell furnace and even more at surrounding furnaces. Several of them ended up buried as the British approached the area in 1777. Some were found immediately, and most of the rest were found by the end of the 19th century. But in 2022, following largely oral tradition, a local legend was vindicated when 4 18-pounder cannon, each 7 feet long and weighing in at 4,500 pounds or about 2 metric tons, these were found in Chester County, Pennsylvania, near Hopewell. Forges, like furnaces, were built alongside streams or rivers or near enough that water might be directed to them through canals or wooden troughs. Though instead of running bellows, these water wheels were important for running the hammers that would pound the slag out of the pig iron to make wrought iron. The water could also run rolling mills and slitters and other early mechanical tools, depending on how much investment a forge owner wanted to or was able to make, or how much interest in the fast-approaching industrial age they had. And again, in the locations where workers could only be hired and not purchased or leased, innovations on how these forges ran were earlier to develop. Now this will come to matter in Season 4, as the free states begin to seriously pursue industrialization and manufactured goods, while the slave states remained in the raw material business. Due to the smoke, the noise, and the fire danger a forge presented, they were wisely located on the outskirts of any town. But they always wanted to be close to a market, a place to sell their goods, and to have a customer base to come in for repairs and custom orders. But on the outskirts, that's still near a town, so workers at forges tended to live at or nearby the forges, but still had access to all the produce of the surrounding farms. Some forges were small ones that took in prepared bars of iron and shaped them into items for the locality. These forges could be located almost anywhere as they did not require water power. But the large ones that processed pig iron into wrought iron of different grades, these had to be near running water. Often, they would even be on a navigable river. This made shipping in the iron pigs easier, but however it was done, diverted water to run a hammer for pounding the slag out of the iron was essential. I mean, it can be done by human power alone, but it produces iron at a cost that makes it more expensive than silver or gold. So water-powered hammers was the way of the world in America. While some forges brought in all the food for the workers, or the workers went home for their main meals, it was also common for large forges to be part of a larger agricultural operation. This combined approach, again, tended to be more common in the southern states where plantation owners built up small empires under their rule. Many of the plantations were even only accessible by water, all people and produce entering and leaving by boat and barge. The workers at the forge worked up a prodigious appetite with long days over heavy and hot work. So impressive amounts of food, including larger than normal amounts of meat, were typically made available. Being closer to regular farm, village, or town operations, bread, fresh foods, including milk in season, and produce were more available to forge workers typically than to those working at furnaces. While forge workers' appetites would be large, the menu they were offered would be very typical for the time, only suffering salted meat at the times of year when all people were eating it, in the hardest of winter and at the start of spring, when everyone faced a shortage of fresh foods. The one appetite of the forge that would be unusual was the one for charcoal, especially at the large forges, so forests of trees would also be cut down to feed these fires. Which finally brings us to Valley Forge. We've all heard the name. It's the place where the Continental Army wintered and more or less starved at times. Why there? Well, in the midst of the rolling Pennsylvania hills along the Schuylkill River, there was an area of open land where an army might camp. Why was this area open when so much of those hills were covered with hardwoods of the region? Because on one of the large tributaries into the Schuylkill, Valley Creek, there had been a forge, the kind we're talking about, with a finery and mills and such, making iron bar to sell to blacksmiths and turning out wrought iron products and such. Less sophisticated operations had existed along this cooperative creek, but in the 1740s, Mount Joy Forge, known locally as the Valley Forge because, it was the forge in the valley, continued the practice of using charcoal made from the local trees, creating an open space. And because it was one of the big forges, acres and acres had already been cut over. At the opening of the Revolutionary War, this forge was a growing concern. And one of the owners had a pretty substantial house built there with stables and a garden and so on. But then, in 1777, the British burned down the ironworks. So no more nails, no more cart tires, and no more iron for those annoying long rifles that would come out of this forge. 3 months later, Washington would make it his winter headquarters. With the forge in ruin, the location was pretty good for its new use. It was within wagon and barge distance of farming communities, so food could be brought in and sold to the soldiers just as it had been for the forge workers. But what had been several handfuls of people working in and around the forge and farmlands exploded into 12,000. Soldiers, yes, but also the campaign community. Women, children, servants, support staff, horse boys, laundresses, suppliers, the works. And so the grass of the fields was eaten by the livestock and died off with the arrival of winter. And the area became a sodden, muddy mess. And with such a concentration of humans, alas, food, water, and firewood were short. It was tough enough to get food in, and the trees were cut down. The wood supply continued to move further and further away. And latrine discipline was far from ideal. What had been an assortment of quite drinkable streams became fouled. So springs and streams from further away ended up supplying the water. And for anyone who has carried a few gallons of water any distance in a bucket with a rope handle, like rocks, water is heavy, even if you have one of those nice bucket yokes. As food became shorter, much of the campaign community melted away. For those soldiers and families that hung on, when supplies were held up by snowdrifts and a frozen river, any source of flavor, even ersatz food, was sought, which is where we, at last, get to answer the question, did people really boil their boots to make soup? The answer is yes. Was it any good? Well, that one more depends on just how hungry you are. The leather these soldiers were working with was, how can I say it, meatier than modern leather. There was more protein left in it to be boiled into a soup. Leather, as a product of the skin of pigs and cows and deer and horses, etc., is full of collagen and other nutritious and flavorful stuff. I mean, have you seen the market for pork rinds? When this skin was turned into leather, much of the material that was tasty to humans and bugs and bacteria was altered and then rinsed away or made extremely difficult to digest. However, the bases used in the pre-chemical age did an incomplete job of stripping away the tasty bits. Further, animal fats were used in the finishing processes for making leather, and fats were regularly rubbed into leathers to make them stand up to weather and use. Therefore, when nothing else was on hand to be consumed and one was very, very, very hungry, boiled leather could be made into a sort of terrible jerky soup. Would I recommend it? No, not at all. But did it work as a stopgap when all routes in for food were blocked up by weather? Sort of, somewhat. It was better than absolutely and utterly nothing. So when you run across old cartoons of the hobos riding the rails and boiling their boots, it's in the fine tradition of soldiers everywhere. From Valley Forge and Napoleon's troops trying to get back from Moscow to poorly supplied or abandoned armies everywhere. As far back in time that armies were issued leather footwear. So there we are. Ironworks in early America are woven into the country's fabric from the start and are intertwined with food in obvious ways, but in many others that are not so clear. And American iron will continue to be used to keep enslaved people captive and growing food and tobacco and fiber for the American engine of industry and export, as tools and as shackles. Next week, that's enough iron and war specifics. Let's move on to the sweet stuff. So, if the sugar islands in the Caribbean were all British, did the Americans stop with the sugar? Or were there other sources? And what's up with maple syrup, for example? Do we hear from the French or maybe the Dutch? All these questions and more will be answered as I talk about our national sweet tooth during America's earliest years. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles, along with cool book recommendations, will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thank you to those of you who have been leaving me reviews. Now, some are hard to find based on the way the podcast world is all fractured, but when I do run across them, they are a wonderful surprise. You can find me on most of the internets at THoAFood. And you can check out my new podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, with my co-host, Jamie Lewis. And it's all about the 19th century mayhem, and it's available on your favorite podcast widget as well. Though, just so you know, this one isn't E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and all this information and more is also in the show description.